Welcome back to another episode of House to Home. This is a podcast brought to you by Family Policy Alliance Foundation. My name is Grace Youngson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Joseph Kohm. And we are looking forward to covering a really important topic today, which is answering the question of where our rights come from. And this is especially important right now because there's been a very recent story in the news surrounding this issue. Joseph, would you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I'd love to, Grace. Thanks for the introduction. And yes, welcome to our audience. There's been a bit of a hubbub in Washington that has prompted this story and our examination of this subject. And that is a story of a hearing for one of President Donald J. Trump's nominations to the State Department. This nominee is Riley Barnes, and they were having a hearing for this person several weeks ago in the Senate. And there were, of course, senators from both parties that were examining this nominee as part of the process. And I'm ashamed to say, I think one of my senators here in this great Commonwealth of Virginia kind of disgraced himself with his remarks. I don't say that lightly, but I've as long as I've been alive, pretty much Senator Tim Kaine has been one of our senators here in the Commonwealth. And so the nominee in question had echoed during one of the questions posed to him. It echoed in one of his answers. He referenced something Secretary Marco Rubio had said, our Secretary of State, saying that rights come from God, not the government. So Senator Kaine responded at this juncture by saying that notion that rights come from God, not the government, was, quote, extremely troubling. And he went on to compare it to the government of Iran, which is a theocracy. And rather than try to describe this to you folks, I think we're just going to play the clip of Senator Kaine right now. So let's watch that clip. Okay, Grace, well, there you have it. That was Senator Kaine saying this very troubling idea. It's worth emphasizing to our audience, Senator Kaine has been in his office for decades. This is a long-term incumbent senator from the Democrat Party representing Virginia. This has obviously generated a big hubbub. Definitely not the first time Senator Cruz and Senator Kaine have clashed. But Senator Cruz reminded us that our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, states that all men and consequently all women are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Endowed by their Creator. He referenced a great Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. And we were initially going to cover the story ending there, but there's been more since then. There's created a public backlash, particularly online, where this clip went viral. The great Bishop Robert Barron, Catholic bishop who runs Word on Fire Ministries, published an op-ed critiquing the senator and humbly suggesting that he revisit his civics lessons. So in response to this, Senator Kaine, unfortunately, has doubled down on his comments rather than apologize for them. He did this in an op-ed for, I believe, the New York Times. And in this op-ed, which I found a little disingenuous, but we can talk about that later, Grace. He simply insisted that he does affirm Creator-endowed rights, but as they are, he said, quote, "they are meaningless unless protected by law." And he cited examples like slavery, voting rights, jury trials as proof that law must secure rights. So I like that he brought up those items because I'll remind us of them later when I talk about why I think that op-ed is disingenuous. But that's basically the summary of the facts that have happened that have prompted Grace and I to have this discussion about where rights come from. So, Grace, what did you think when you heard the story? When you heard Senator Kaine's speech, like what were your first thoughts?
Honestly, I think my first thoughts, especially as someone who is not an American, born and bred an American.
I'm sorry that document was written as a part of our secession from your great King George III. Grace, sorry, we're fighting over a document that separated our countries. But anyway, go ahead.
We won't talk about that part. I think actually, it's interesting you said he needs to revisit his civics lessons because I actually took US civics in high school, and then I went on to study politics with Cambridge for a while. And this was one of the biggest things I took away from those studies was the fact that America was founded in a very unique way, and that was because you guys believed that your rights come from God. And what struck me, especially as I studied politics, what really struck me during my time studying was any form of government that lacks that premise, that acknowledgement of God and of the fact that He gave us our rights, ultimately ends in human destruction. We look at Marxist governments, communist governments. Those types of governments believe that your value is in relation to what you contribute to the government and to society. It's not about how God sees you. And once you start going down that path, and certain people may be seen to contribute less to society, they now have less value, and therefore we can kind of take their rights away. That is an extremely dark path to go down. And I think my first reaction hearing that this is now being questioned, or that a senator who is supposed to be helping make sure that the Constitution is protected in the policies that are being passed, is actually saying something that is very anti the very founding of this country, is pretty concerning.
Yeah, that's well said. I think my take, I'm sorry, Grace, is a little bit more cynical. Like, you're absolutely right. So this is a take alongside yours. Maybe it's because I've been jaded by suffering under the rule of Senator Kaine for all these years as a Virginian. But honestly, so there are times if you do the kind of work that Grace and I and the team here at FPAF do, you start to get this understanding of what the DC bubble is. You know, the DCMA, call it the swap or whatever you want, and every now and then some piece of news happens, something will go viral that will be an example of, there's the bubble in action. And I'm sorry to say that was my first thought when I saw this, is Tim Kaine is so high on his own supply. He is so lost in the DC bubble that he thought he could say this and there would be no backlash. Like, he is convinced that the whole majority of the country is with him on this. He's trying to set up this nominee from the administration as an outlier, when the reality is at least half the country believes exactly what the Declaration of Independence says, probably more. He clearly said this without expecting this would turn into this viral storm that he and his team have had to deal with on the PR front, and I think retroactively change his argument through that op-ed. He really thought people were with him on this, and in that sense, it was incredibly insulting to half of Americans, at least, who believe that our rights come from God and are then established by law. He really believed they'd be with him. And to compare half of Americans to the Iranian government is such an insult. The Iranian government is a theocratic hellscape. There are no rights for women in Iran. There are no rights for gay people in Iran. Now, to be clear, FPAF doesn't support the notion of gay marriage. We believe marriage is between a man and a woman. But we definitely don't believe, as Iran believes, that gay people should be executed for that, for example. He compared Americans to this. I think the additional layer of insult to it for me, Grace, was that I'm a veteran of the U.S. Army, and a lot of my friends fought terrorists that were directly funded by the Iranian government. The Iranian government is the biggest state sponsor of terror in the world. They continue to do it. They're an enemy of Western values everywhere they go, and they are hell-bent on getting a nuclear weapon so they can destroy Western values, particularly the state of Israel. So I say all that so that we get the sense of just what an insult this was to half of Americans. And it was a totally avoidable thing. If the senator and his team had simply known that half of Americans believe this and agree with it, I think he would have tailored his argument a bit differently, and I think that's what we got in round 2 in his op-ed, which we can talk more about later. But that was my first reaction, Grace. I'm sorry it's a cynical one, and I'm sorry it's a strong one, but I didn't see any other way to read that personally.
Yeah, I totally get your reaction. I think that makes me think of a couple things I would love to touch on from that, is that I think, you talk about this bubble, and there a lot of times in certain aspects of culture today, it is assumed that some people assume that when they're speaking out on something, they're speaking for the majority. And here he was making that assumption, as is assumed in lots of other issues, when actually it is a minority that they're speaking right now. And the media will often portray these things as, oh no, it's the majority that believes this. And that's just not the way that it is. So I think it's important to recognize that. And for each of us, as we're looking at all this media online, you have to be astute to recognize that just because you've seen it or you've seen it it seems like you're seeing things everywhere, does not mean that is the prevailing opinion. A lot of times, there is more money in certain sides of the movement, or certain sides, I shouldn't say of the movement, of the political culture, that just allows them to make it appear like they're more, they are the majority, but they're not the majority. And even this is a Christian belief issue anyway. As Christians, whatever, if we're the majority, we should believe in what God says anyway. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on was, you talked about Iran and he compared it to Iran. And I think that you perfectly pointed out the flaw in that. The Bible very clearly says that every single human being is made in the image of God and is valuable. God knit together each and every one of us in our mother's womb. Actually, Jesus valued women, and God values women way more than any other belief system really does. And so to compare it to Iran, which in a sense you could say is built off of religion, but in their religion, it talks about the fact that women are not as valuable. And, that, as you said, if you're engaging in a homosexual relationship, again, you're not as valuable or whatever. You cannot compare the two because they have completely different messages about them. And America was founded on an idea of true equality, where everyone has equal worth and value, and that is a biblical value. And so that, I think it's important to completely dispel that. So yeah, I think this is kind of a crazy story, and I do want to encourage our viewers, you may not have really thought about the fact of, okay, where do our rights even come from? I mean, it's not like it's a conversation you just have on a daily basis with people, but this is really important to understand and make sure that the way that our country is being ran is reflecting the truth.
Amen. I thought when I was reading it, I appreciated that Senator Cruz brought up Thomas Jefferson, regardless of what you may think of Senator Cruz. I appreciated the reference to him because Thomas Jefferson was a very flawed human being, like we all are. And nobody's more familiar with that than we who live in Virginia. And so what Senator Kaine's comments reeked of to me is a term that C.S. Lewis coined called chronological snobbery. Chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis defined it, is the belief that someone is wrong simply because they lived in an earlier time than you did in history. That simply because they lived earlier in history than you did, that their ideas were more primitive than yours, less advanced, less progressive, that therefore they're wrong and you can dismiss them. And that is a very dangerous notion. It's also very obnoxious, I won't say. Lewis points that out. But I say this as a lead-in because ultimately chronological snobbery is antithetical to all of Christian belief, all of Judeo-Christian belief, because the notion that rights come from our Creator goes all the way back to the absolute beginning of time and creation as recorded in the Bible and the book of Genesis, which us and the Jewish faith shares. Right from then, men and women are created in the image of God, which confers a value and a set of rights on them because they bear that image. And that is reaffirmed throughout our scriptures, throughout the life of Christ, throughout the writings of the apostles, and throughout the history of the early church. The church made its mark by standing up for people's rights, like especially women's rights, Grace. I'm so glad you pointed that out. And that's the tradition that we are stepping into. And chronological snobbery puts the holder of it in danger of dismissing all of that simply because, they're ancient, they're primitive, we've moved on, we've moved past that. Well, that's a very dangerous thing that can lead you to violating those rights that have existed from the beginning of time, whether we recognize them or not. So there's just a little bit of civics, a little touch. And I'll just I'll wrap this comment up by just telling our audience, we have training programs to train you up in these sorts of things at FPAF. We have a number of different programs, like the School Board Academy does a lesson on this. Most of our other training programs that you can find at our website, fpaf.com. We equip people to advocate for these rights and why they're important and why we have them. So just a plug there for some of our programs here at FPAF. What do you think, Grace? Should we go to a break here?
Sounds great to me.
Great. We'll be back in a few minutes, folks.
We believe you were born for such a time as this. Our ministry exists to empower you to understand your identity in Christ, discover your gifts and calling through intentional discipleship, and to launch you out as a leader in your community. We're not just here to talk about faith, we're here to live it out. That means engaging culture. That means leading with truth. And yes, that means stepping into spaces that shape our world, including government. Whether you're an artist, an entrepreneur, a teacher, a nurse, or anything in between, government affects your life. Policies and laws shape the culture you work in, the freedoms you have, and the values that get promoted. That's why it's not enough to sit on the sidelines. We need young Christians running for office, serving on school boards, working in public policy, and voting with a biblical worldview. We need you to care. Because as Proverbs 29:2 says, when godly people lead, the people rejoice. This generation has the passion, the voice, the boldness. Now it's time to match that with truth, discipleship, and purpose. So here's the call. Pray, vote, engage. Be disciples, be leaders. Let's raise up next-gen leaders who carry Christ into culture and shape the future of our nation, starting with you. Join the movement of 1630 and lead the change.
Well, welcome back. I'm going to read a quote from James Madison that relates pretty well to this. He said, "We have staked the whole of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, to govern ourselves according to the 10 commandments of God."
That's a powerful quote, Grace, because it's direct historical evidence to what we've been saying in this podcast, and frankly, what the social conservative movement has been saying throughout America's entire existence, is that we are a Christian-rooted nation in our ideals, our system of government, the rights it confers, roots back to God. So I'm glad we found that to read for this show. Like you said, it's appropriate. And
I 100% agree.
Yeah, thank you. So as our audience knows, we like to do a session before we finish our show where we just what we call "What Would the Other Side Say?" We give counter arguments. We argue in the alternative, as I might say back in my law school days. And here, we have show prep that tells us that we've created with some of these arguments. But this is where I'm just going to address the op-ed that Senator Kaine wrote in the New York Times. I've hinted at it a couple times now, Grace. So just very, very briefly, what the senator tried to argue in his follow-up op-ed was that rights do come from the Creator, which is not what he said in the clip that we played for you earlier. But he said rights do come from the Creator, and I'm affirming that, but just because they come from the Creator, they're meaningless unless they're established by law. And he cited something like slavery to one of these examples, which is a great example for him to cite here. I'm so happy he did, because it actually proves my point, that that whole saga of America reckoning with its terrible history of racism as an aberration from the great history of America, and then it's reckoning with it and coming to terms with it. I think it reminds me of what Dr. King said about the Declaration of Independence, which is that it is a promissory note to all Americans of all races, meaning that when it says that all men are created equal, it means all men. And the history of America, through Dr. King, was America coming to terms with that and conforming its laws to it, which is where the senator's op-ed is disingenuous and where he gets the order of things wrong. Our rights come from government, and the whole point of government is to conform its laws to those rights, is to establish rules to ensure that those rights you already have cannot be violated by the government. That was the point. That's the chain of events. Not as Senator Kaine says, you don't have the rights until they're secured by law. No, you have the rights. Government's job isn't to give you those rights and secure them. Government's job is to ensure no one can violate those rights by conforming its rules to God's created order. That's what, as an example, our saga with ending slavery and establishing civil rights for African Americans was all about, conforming our laws to what we already knew was true. The country just wasn't ready to accept yet at the time the Declaration was signed. So I just wanted to give that argument in the alternative, Grace.
Yes, I agree with you there. And I think that, it's again, I just echo, it's very important to recognize, because he called it troubling. So, it should never be troubling to us, the idea that our rights come from God. That is the most secure way that our rights would come. And so, especially those in government, they should be able to recognize that. And it goes back to the quote from James Madison: this country, and there's other similar founding fathers quotes, that talk about this, the way that this country has been set up to be governed is only to be done so off of Christian morals and run by a people that attest to those morals. Otherwise, the system will not work. And I think that that's the concerning portion, is if we lose the belief and the recognition of that, the system, the republic, the constitutional republic that this nation is, will fail to work unless we have that foundation.
Yeah, that's well said too. I feel like our religious texts and the truth we know from God are like the mooring that keeps laws anchored. That's how I've thought about it before, at least in the sense that if you detach the two, if your law gets divorced from your rights, because that's another objection here, right? Is that one of the ones we prepared in our show prep was grounding rights in God is arbitrary and opens the door to mixing church and state. And I find that argument unpersuasive too, because as I was saying, if you divorce these two things entirely, then laws become simply arbitrary, and you get open to just the rule of the majority and massive rights violations. I think, for example, the French Revolution, where when they completely tried to eliminate the church and religion from French culture, it led to just that: mass rights violations, mass executions. I mean, the streets of Paris literally ran red with blood during that time, because their laws had no mooring to the truths of God's creation and the rights he conferred on us as his image bearers. And so you need the laws to keep, or you need rights to keep your laws moored to that truth. Otherwise, law just becomes whatever people want it. And God forbid you find yourself in the minority. That's when people who are in the minority are in big trouble. And it's sad that we have historical examples of that. I think the point of having them is that we reference them to not allow them to happen again.
Yeah, it's almost like Senator Kaine seems to make the argument that we're trying to say we don't need the law. That's like very, very far from what we're trying to say. We're trying to say that the law has to respect the ultimate law, which is God's law. And so, it's all about the starting point, and obviously the law is extremely important. But that has to be a reflection and a response and a recognition of God's law. So
that's good.
Yeah.
I think one more objection I just think we should cover is the whole idea for people to say, this is just words. This is just political theater. This stuff happens all the time. It's not a big deal. It's just part of the game, they would say. And I see where they're coming from, but I feel like that's a dangerous notion too, because words matter. You create things with your words. And I think that has an impact on future generations and their perceptions of our rights. So as an example, there's great but scary polling out these days showing that strong segments of college students, members of Generation Z and A, have very anti-free speech worldviews. So we can break this down in research that shows that a lot of college students believe it's okay to chase speakers off campus if you don't like their beliefs. So a lot of them even say it's okay to use violence to silence people who disagree with you. And when you lose concept of rights, you think words are just words. Well, it's contradictory. They're basically saying, oh, words don't matter, but also words are violence. So those two things can't coexist. But at the same time, if you think our rights don't belong to the Creator, or what Senator Kaine says, these lies don't matter, well, you have whole generations being inculcated to think it's totally okay for me to create an environment in my university, place of learning and truth seeking, where certain people cannot come and speak and share their views. So words do matter, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's good. Actually, I think that the way that things are phrased can really be the difference between life and death. And to me, a prime example of that would be the abortion issue. The way that the even the terminology pro-choice, it's not even true. But the way that the phraseology is so deceptive kind of numbs people out a little bit more to actually what the issue is. And that to me is an example of how words and a narrative and the way you message on things can dramatically change the way that we see things, the way that we accept things. And so, yes, words do matter. And it's not just, I think that some people, some Christians who don't want to be involved in politics have this exact argument of you're just kind of arguing over useless things. No, we're arguing, or not even arguing, we're just reminding you that politics, which is extremely important because it deals with how your life is ran, how your children's lives go. It deals with the protections or lack of protections that you have. It deals with life and death. It should be something that has God's values, a biblical worldview in there. And it's just like anything else in life. When we neglect to put God at the center, we then go down a path of destruction. So I think that was really good that you reminded us of that, Joseph.
Well, you too, Grace. You reinforced it there, and I appreciate your perspective on it. I think that's right. Abortion is a great example of where people on one side employ the use of euphemisms, where instead of being pro-abortion, you're now pro-choice. Instead of a baby, it's a fetus. And this is why words do matter, and talk about our rights mattering. By euphemistically terming a baby a fetus, now you can violate the baby's rights through abortion. So that's just a small slice off the top example of how this can have, like you said, Grace, a life and death impact. So with that, I think we should wrap up. I want to thank our audience for joining us for this show. Thanks for listening to our takes on this story that, who knows, we may get some more developments, but this is where things stand now. And I thought this was a good opportunity to discuss this very important lesson of not just American, but worldwide civics. So thank you for joining us for it. House to Home is a product of Family Policy Alliance Foundation, and we are a weekly podcast. So if you like this show, if you like this kind of coverage and conversation and learning, we welcome you to please follow, subscribe, leave us a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. It really helps us. And if you like this kind of content and information generally, we'd invite you to follow Family Policy Alliance Foundation on social media. Our social media handles are @family_policy. So thank you again for listening. We'll be back next week with another new episode of House to Home.